do we know like what our GPA or what our grades in are for each?
Okay, last time we ended by talking about how by 1891 Russia and France had formed an alliance, a military alliance with one another. Now, France was under the Third Republic. Russia was an autocratic empire ruled by divine right of kings, by a czar. The only thing they had in common was they both had a beef against the Germans. So it was an alliance made based on mutual fear and distrust. Now, as we'll see today, eventually Great Britain would be added to the mix, and they would join with France and Russia against Germany. And now Great Britain normally did not get involved in affairs of the continent. Historically, Great Britain kind of was proud of its great overseas empire and its control of India and its fleet, and did not bother with anything going on in the European continent until, in some way, they felt their empire, their overseas empire, their commercial interests were at risk. And that's exactly what happened here. In the 1890s, it became very clear to Great Britain that of all the nations in the world, Germany posed the greatest threat to the British Empire. And so even though Great Britain and France had a history of being hostile to one another, Great Britain decided to let that aside and decided that its best interest was to join with France and Russia against Germany, and that put into place the alliance system that would lead to World War I. So that's how you get the triple entente of Great Britain, France, and Russia versus the central empires of Austria-Hungary and Germany. Now, now to understand why Great Britain would all of a sudden decide that Germany was the greatest threat to its empire, you have to remember that from the 1880s and 1890s all the way until the opening of World War I, there was imperialism fever going on. You've heard of boogie fever? Boogie fever. Right? This is imperialism fever. I mean, people were just going nuts. They were just European nations all felt like they had to get on board on the imperialism train, baby, and they all had to acquire empires and acquire lands and become powerful. And so you have this kind of this mentality like if we don't gobble up land in Asia and Africa, our enemies will. So we have to get on. We have to get our empire going here. And so there was this literally a race among the great European powers to see how much territory they could gobble up as quickly as possible in Asia and in Africa. Now this race for empire had a huge impact on Asia and Africa, because these countries that were invaded and occupied by European powers, this occupation had a lot of, well, some positive, but a lot of real negative results for large swaths of territory in Africa and Asia. And you can make the argument that in Asia and Africa they're still reeling from these events. In fact, if you look at the Middle East today and the Arab Spring, a lot of the developments that are happening in that part of the world today were happening 100 years ago during imperialism fever, in the sense that you had a lot of an uprising of the masses against oppression, against what they viewed as foreign oppression. So this was and so these events, this race for empire, this imperialism of the late 19th, early 20th century would have some very long-term consequences for Europe and the world in general. So let's talk about this race for empire. Now, it's important to remember that that imperialism had been around for a long time. I mean, imperialism was nothing new. It's just that from the 1880s through the end of the outbreak of World War I, in that brief period of time, imperialism just had a particular new flavor to it. It's sometimes called the new imperialism. So what was the old imperialism? Well, the old imperialism was just expanding one's commercial interests. You know, both France and Great Britain. And Great Britain in particular was the old champion of old imperialism. They had built an empire going back to the 18th century that was based on commerce and trade. You know, acquiring overseas lands to expand their markets for their goods and to acquire raw materials. They've been doing that for a long time. They were the master of old imperialism. Just give you a couple examples here. The British East India Company, remember, was a private company that controlled India. And ever since about the middle of the 18th century, when the British were kicked out the French from India, and actually, you know, the British East India Company made a fortune because they controlled the trade that between India and China. In fact, you've heard of the country of Singapore? Singapore was originally a fort that the British acquired on the Straits of Malacca. It's a key strategic route that goes from between Indonesia, what is today Indonesia, and Malaysia. And the British got control of this fort because they wanted to secure the trade route from China to India. And so that's how the British were able, in the early part of the 19th century, to, by 1824 or so, take over what is today and establish Singapore and control over Malaysia. And then they began to sell opium to the Chinese. Now we know that opium is not a very, you get heroin from opium. Opium comes from poppy seeds, and they would, a lot of this opium would be produced in what is today Afghanistan and Pakistan and India, and then the British East India would ship it. So in this particular period, the biggest drug dealers in the world were the British government and the British East India Company. And not only the Brits, but the Americans as well. You know, one of America's most famous presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His family made their money in the drug business. Delano was on his mother's side of the family, and they were a Boston, Massachusetts wealthy family that worked with the British East India Company to bring opium to China. Now, so the drug trade made a lot of money for Great Britain, and but the problem was that it created this huge drug dependency problem in China. They were called opium dens, where all these Chinese people were getting hooked on drugs, and they were spending all their time sitting around smoking dope, smoking opium. So the Chinese government said, this stuff's dangerous. We got to stop this. So they banned the importation of opium. And the British went to war against them. The British government went to war to sell more drugs. I love it. Isn't that great? If you talk to some of these Anglophiles, and some of these people say, the British Empire was such a force for good. We brought nobility. We brought government. We brought civilization to the world. Aren't we Brits great? I mean, they say that all the time. All you have to do is say, yeah, opium war, baby. Down. You lose. That's all you got to do. Anyway, so they went to war against China, and the British had a larger fleet. They defeated the Chinese fleet, which wasn't large at that point, and actually the British government forced the Chinese government to to give them the little island of Hong Kong. It was a little island off the coast, and the British government used Hong Kong to be their main area to import drugs into Chinese mainland. So Hong Kong became a British possession that was used as the place where the British East India Company could sell drugs to the Chinese, and other products too, not just opium. So, and that's why Hong Kong went from being a sleepy little fishing village to becoming one of the biggest cities in China. In fact, it was only transferred back to Chinese rule in 1997. It was a British possession from 1842 till 1997. Now, actually, you'd think the British East India Company selling drugs, that's awful. Well, they got their comeuppance. You know, I mean, there's always, for every action, there's a reaction. And in 1857, it's called the Indian Mutiny. What happened was that, remember, the British East India Company employed sepoys. These were, they could be Muslims, they could be Hindus who were, or they could be Sikhs who were trained in European styles of warfare, but had British officers. And the sepoys were in the thousands. They were the shock troops of the British East India Company. Well, in 1857, there was a massive mutiny. Turns out that even though Hindus and Muslims did not like each other in India, traditionally, they both agreed that they both hated Christians and British people. By the mid-19th century, the British were introducing Christianity to India, and some of the Hindus and Muslims found this objectionable, so they decided it was time to strike. So there was a massive mutiny of the sepoys in 1857, and they went on a rampage. Thousands and thousands of Christians and mainly British residents in India were slaughtered. It was a bloodbath. Now, what the sepoys wanted to do was to reinstate the Mughal emperor as the ruler of all India. You know, you still had a Mughal dynasty in place. They only controlled the area in and around Delhi in central India, but they were still in place. So that's what the mutineers wanted to do. They wanted to restore the emperor, the Mughal dynasty, to its full glory and expel all the British. Well, when news of all these massacres and all this bloodshed reached Great Britain, there was a lot of anger. So the British sent the British Army in, and they massacred a lot of people in turn. So it was a real, very violent event altogether. Now, eventually, the mutineers were crushed. The British government at this point decided that the Mughal dynasty had to go. The last Mughal emperor was sent into exile to Burma, and it was in 1857 it was decided that Queen Victoria would now be the Empress of India. So the Mughal dynasty was, it had been around for a long time, basically just as a figurehead. Now it was gone, and now Queen Victoria, the Queen of Great Britain, was also now Empress of India. So the British government took over direct control over India, primarily because they didn't have a choice, because basically the mutiny had destroyed a lot of the infrastructure of the British East India Company anyway. Now, the French were in the exact same business. The French were probably, they were weak rivals, but they were also into commercial imperialism. That is, acquiring overseas territories primarily for economic reasons, just to acquire markets or raw materials. And now, for example, in 1830, we've already discussed this when we talked about the 1830 revolution in France. French troops went into Algiers in North Africa primarily to stop attacks by Algerian pirates against French shipping, and to kind of clear the Mediterranean of piracy. The Americans had the same problem. You know, the United States sent naval forces to Tripoli in what is today Libya to stop Muslim pirates, corsairs, from attacking American ships. And I don't know if you've heard of that. I'm aware of that war. It was in the news recently because Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time when it happened, wrote that letter to the ruler, the Muslim ruler of Tripoli, and said something to the effect, well, you know, we're not a Christian nation, so you can't fight a jihad against us. We're a secular nation. And then that letter was in the news because there's this big question about whether the founding fathers were Christian or not. So, but anyway, I don't know if you've heard of it. That'd be something you could talk about. Hey, there's a report right there. But anyway, so these pirates had been in the business of attacking ships, and they've been doing this since the days of the Ottoman Empire, the glory days. You know, think of Barbarossa in the 16th century. So you had these Muslim pirates fighting jihad, attacking Christian ships on the seas. The French decided enough's enough. They sent in troops, and they occupied Algiers and actually sent colonists to settle in Algeria in North Africa. The French intervened in Southeast Asia. By the middle of the 19th century, the silk weaving and silk cloth manufacturing business had really taken off in France, and it became a big part of their economy. And Napoleon III, who was the ruler at the time, decided that it was important to secure silk. You know where you get silk from silk worms, right? And so in 1858, the French government decided to occupy Vietnam. The Vietnam was like Korea. It was ruled by the Nguyen dynasty. It had a system of government modeled on China's, and the ruler, the emperor of Vietnam, was actually a vassal of the emperor of China. So in 1858, France went to war against China, kind of like what the Brits did, and went to war against Vietnam, and they occupied Saigon, and this was the beginning of the French Empire in Indochina. That was, Indochina is a fancy way of talking about Southeast Asia, that particular area. Anyway, so we see both the French and the British engaged in economic imperialism, using their military forces to advance their commercial interests. The British in India and China, the French in China and Southeast Asia. Now, when we get to this particular period, we start getting to the late 19th century, though, imperialism, this quote unquote new imperialism, really kind of took off. And it wasn't just didn't involve Great Britain. I mean, all the great European powers all got involved in this race for empire. So what was driving this drive for empire? And it's important to remember that there were a lot of different factors, and not all are more important than others. But I just want to give you some factors, and it's up to you to kind of in your mind to think, okay, what were more important than others? It's debatable anyway. What are more important than others? But a couple things. Remember we talked about social Darwinism, this idea that some people are less advanced than others. This idea of social evolution. Remember Herbert Spencer was a big proponent of that idea. That by the late 19th, early 20th century, social Darwinism had become the way that educated people looked at the world. The elite looked at the world, and many European nations figured, we can go in and even though we might believe in the principles of liberalism and the equality of all men, obviously people in Asia and Africa are not our equals. They're obviously at a less advanced stage of evolution. So basically, it's okay for us to go in there and take over their territories. I mean, we're more advanced. We're at a higher level of consciousness. We're a higher level of development. So therefore, us going into these territories is perfectly legitimate and perfectly consistent with our belief in liberalism, because they're not really people. They're sub-people. They're people at a lower stage. They're like children. They're like kids, and we're the adults. So the spread of social Darwinism ideas advanced this new notion of imperialism. It gave people ideological cover. It gave them the ability to justify their actions. But it wasn't just social Darwinism, obviously. That was more of a justification than a cause. Another factor was that by the time we get to this period, with all this nationalism going on, many people figured that if they did not control these territories, their enemies would. It was a matter of national security. If with all these nations competing with one another, and here we see social Darwinism as well. One of the principles of social Darwinism was that life is a struggle. It's a competition, a constant competition for survival. And many European nations figured, well, if we're in a struggle for survival, we have to go out and get these territories, or our enemies will. It's a matter of national security. It's a matter of survival. So that was really motivating these nations to want to go out and take over these territories, because if they didn't do it, their enemies would. And then another thing that came on at this time period was that there was this general belief that the key to being a great nation was having a navy. There was an American author named Alfred McMahon, who had, in 1890, I think, wrote a book called the History of Sea Power, or a whole book that was very influential at the time. And but it kind of caught the fancy of the world, and it was believed at this time that having a big navy and having big technological warships, big battle cruisers, was a sign that you were a great power. The big battleships were the weapon of mass destruction of the late 19th century. You know, if you had these weapons, you were a great and mighty power. Just like Iran wants to get nuclear weapons, well, they say they don't, but they really do. I mean, having nuclear weapons today is a sign that you've arrived. That's the measure of greatness today. Back 100 years ago, it was having a big navy. So having a big navy and having empires, overseas empires, was seen as a mark of a great power. Every European nation, they wanted to be a great power. So it was a matter of pride to have, a national pride to have these big navies. Another idea at this time was that, another powerful motivating factor at this time was that many European policymakers came to believe that one reason why their economies were struggling, one reason why their economies were going into having these periods of decay, this kind of, we talked about this roller coaster effect, where the economies grow, the economies decline. Many policymakers said, you know what, it's a problem with not having enough markets and not having enough access to raw materials. So it was generally believed by European policymakers, and this came to believe in America as well, that if you wanted to avoid these big panics and these big economic downturns, the key to doing that was to acquire overseas territories, because that would guarantee you a market. I mean, if you control the territory, they have to buy your goods, right? And you are guaranteed a source of raw materials. So it was believed that by having an empire, you could avoid these economic downturns and have a more stable economy. You wouldn't have these big swings and these panics if you could have a guaranteed market for your goods. So many European policymakers said, we need to have an empire. It's not just a matter of national security, it's a matter of economic health. I mean, if we don't have these empires, what are we going to do? Now, recently, a historian looked at all the data from this period, and in hindsight is 2020. You've maybe heard that phrase. And when you look back at something, it's a lot of times it's a lot easier to look at them objectively. And this historian, what he did is he measured how much money it cost to acquire these empires, and then he looked at how much was gained in terms of economic growth from these empires. And after looking at all the statistics, he came to the conclusion that imperialism was not a good economic deal. It actually cost more money in terms of how much money went into conquering these territories than any economic benefit. But you see, that people didn't think that back then. You know, we can look at it from now and see the situation and look at all the data. But back then, people were thinking, man, that'd be great. We want no more economic depressions. We're just going to get these territories, and everything's going to be great. We're going to have a strong economy as far as the eye can see. So it seemed like the answer at the time. Now another idea, and that's why I have old Rudyard up here, was that another factor at this time was that there was this general belief that what the flip side of let's say, remember we talked about social Darwinism? The flip side of social Darwinism was the idea that, let's say these people are inferior, let's say these people are at a less advanced stage of social development, why don't we bring them up? Why don't we do them a favor and bring them the benefits of our wonderful civilization so we can bring them out of the darkness of superstition and primitive life and bring them into a new age of civilization and superior European civilization. So we're not just conquering these people, we're doing them a favor. We're bringing an advanced civilization to them. And now the poet Rudyard Kipling, there you see up there, he actually wrote a poem. It was when the United States took over the Philippines from Spain in 1898. There was a big war. The Filipinos didn't really like American Yankee rule, so they rebelled, and so we had to send all these troops in there to fight the Filipinos. And Rudyard Kipling, a British author, wanted to inspire the Americans to say, well, you're doing great work here. I mean, these Filipinos, they're your little brown brothers. They're not quite as advanced as you are, and you're doing them a favor. You got to go into the Philippines and bring those people out of their primitive life and bring them a more advanced culture. And what we see happening is that in many European countries, in many of these countries in Asia and Africa, when Europeans did take over, maybe inspired by Kipling, they did bring in hospitals and railroads and modern sanitation facilities and build schools, and a lot of missionaries from various Christian denominations came in and established churches and schools. So there was that element there. It wasn't like these people were all a bunch of greedy, mean-spirited, Scrooges out to screw over the people. They actually, there was this sense that they had an obligation to bring science and technology and education and religion to these areas. Now another aspect of all this was many times the people most pushing for imperialism were aristocrats. Because you see, across Europe, in all the military, what you often found was that the ranks of the officers were filled by aristocrats. A service in the military was one of the last ways in which an aristocrat could still feel like they had power. Like, remember the Junkers, the old Prussian aristocracy? They dominated the German military. In Great Britain, the officer corps was dominated by British aristocrats, landowning aristocrats. And so as long as there was a military operations in effect, all of a sudden, if you were a British or a German or a French aristocrat, you could have meaning in your life. You could be powerful. You could be influential. So some of the biggest proponents of imperialism often were the aristocracy, because they saw an opportunity to serve in the military and increase their influence through that process. So all these factors all come into play, and what we see happening, all these factors kind of happening all at the same time, late 19th century, and prompting and starting this wave of imperialism and this race for empire. All right. So let's, there are two areas of interest for imperialism. One was Africa, and one was Asia, especially China. So those were the two parts of the world, Eastern Asia and Africa, where there was the most competition among European powers to control territory. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that these are parts of the world where Europeans had not really exercised any control before. Let's see if I can get this slide to work. Now you can really see it in the history of Africa. All right, so here's a map of Africa. If you look at a map of Africa, let's say 1830, early 19th century, you can see that the areas that are purple. The areas that are purple are the only areas under European control. So you here, here, here. Now you notice that the areas under European control are along the coast, and there's a reason for that. Africa is much of the interior Africa is a big plateau. And so now as you get close to the coast of Africa, the plateau drops. So what that means is that all the major rivers in Africa, they all drop and they go through very, very powerful rapids, as they approach the coast. So the Zambezi, the Niger, the Congo, these great river systems, they all kind of turn into rapids as they get close to the coast. So it was, for European ships, it was impossible to use the rivers to get into the interior of Africa because of these rapids near the coast. So up until the late 19th century, European actual control over Africa was limited to the coast. So you had the British in Sierra Leone, you had the Portuguese in Angola, and in well, what would that be? That would be the Zambezi River Basin. All right, so that's 1830. So Europeans were not in large numbers yet. Now let's look at the situation in 1913. And by the time you get to the eve of World War I, this is Africa in 1913, almost every part of Africa was now controlled by European power. Everything in purple is French. Everything in red is British. This is German. And so basically, it looks like almost every part of Africa is controlled by a European country. The only large area of Africa not controlled by a European country is Ethiopia. There's Ethiopia there. And we'll talk about that, why that was the case in a little bit here. So basically, by the eve of World War I, almost every part of Africa had been annexed by European power. And here's another. This is an interesting anomaly. This is Congo. This is the area ruled by Belgium. We'll talk about that. That's another exception we'll talk about. All right. All right. All right. So now there really was a race for Africa, and all these European powers were competing with each other to get control of it. What started this race? Well, it started when the French and the British began to actually take over parts of Africa. And the story behind that, you have to go back to the construction of the Suez Canal. Egypt was ruled by the Khedive, and the Khedive was independent but nominally a vassal of the Ottoman Sultan. And what happened was that a group of French and British investors got together with the Khedive of Egypt and said, let's build a canal that links the Mediterranean to the Red Sea to facilitate traffic, so ships don't have to go all the way around the Horn of Africa to get to the Indian Ocean. So they built this Suez Canal, which was one of the great engineering achievements of the day. But meanwhile, the Khedive of Egypt, he became more and more dependent upon these French and mainly British bankers to finance the kingdom. And by 1876, though, the Khedive was bankrupt. The Egyptian government owed all this money to British and French bankers, and there was no way they were going to pay. So what happened was that the British in 1876 said, look, you owe us a lot of money, so we're going to send these officials, these British officials, and they're going to run your state for you and run your tax collection service and all that to make sure that they get paid. So the Khedive didn't want to do this, but he had to bring in all these British folks to start running his government to make sure that the debts were paid. Well, this was not well liked, because you got to remember that the people of Egypt are Muslim, and the people of Egypt are Arab. And they're thinking, who are these British Christians coming in and running our country? This is unacceptable. We will not be, we are Muslims, we're proud, we are not going to take this. So by 1882, there were massive uprisings, there were riots. Sound familiar? In Cairo, the streets were on fire. The people were demanding that the infidels be kicked out. Well, the British were thinking, hey, we don't want this because this guy owes a lot of money. So the British government decided in 1882 to send in troops, and the British Army occupied Egypt in 1882. They kept the Khedive in power as a figurehead, but real power was in the hands of the British military. Now, that was in 1882. Now, just 1 year earlier, in 1881, we've already discussed this, pretty much the French did the same thing to the Bey of Tunis, the Ottoman, the Muslim ruler of Tunis. So in 1881 and 1882, both the British and French had taken it upon themselves to occupy major African countries. And now once that happened, though, everybody started taking notice. And that's when the race for Africa just took off. This really started rolling. Now there are a couple of factors that made the European conquest of Africa possible. There's some technological factors. One thing was advances in steamboats. Remember, I mentioned that all the rivers of Africa drop off when they get to the coast, so it's really difficult to get upstream. Well, by the late 19th century, steamboats had enough power, they could generate enough power that they could go upstream. So the French, the British, the Germans, they would all take these steamboats, load them up with troops, and they could advance deep into the interior of Africa along these river systems, like the Congo and the Niger, and then take over these areas. They also had automatic. They had the Gatling gun. They had automatic weapons. Weapons that start. They don't have to. By the late 19th century, they had figured out a way that you didn't have to do all this rigmarole to load a gun. It would you could shoot rapid fire quickly. So they had better improved firearms, and with Gatling gun, which are the forerunner of the machine gun, and with these more advanced weapons, a small group of European soldiers could easily overpower these African states that didn't have these kind of technological resources. So another factor that helped the Europeans was quinine. You see, one of the biggest problems that Europeans had going into the interior of Africa was that they would die like flies. They would get into Africa, and within weeks they'd be dead. And the biggest cause of death was malaria. Malaria, which is carried by mosquitoes, right? Well, somehow they discovered, I don't really know the details here, but somehow they discovered that quinine, if you consume quinine, that makes your blood untasty to mosquitoes. And so, you ever had tonic water? Tonic water was invented as a drink to help soldiers going to Africa so that they could drink it, and that would make them so that they wouldn't be so susceptible to malaria.
Were the Africans not really immune to it, but were their chances?
They have, actually it's kind of sad, the one reason why, and I'm pretty sure this is true, I might be wrong, but I've done some reading, and actually Africans have, ethnic Africans do have a defense against malaria, but it also causes them to have sickle cell anemia.
Okay.
So that's why a lot of African Americans suffer from heart disease. I mean, in Africa, it would be their benefit to have the sickle cell anemia and make them more immune to the mosquitoes and to malaria. But outside of Africa, all it does is give them heart disease. But anyway.
So wait, I'm confused. How does having sickle cell anemia
I don't know.
not
I'm not,
hurt you
I'm
if you're
not
getting
an
bit by
medical guy.
mosquitoes? But
Malaria is a bloodborne pathogen.
Yeah, it
and
prevents-
sickle cells probably just somehow.
okay,
You have to look it
so
up.
the
Wikipedia.
malaria thins out your blood, and sickle cell thickens it, right?
I don't know.
No.
Sickle cell is like a
Yeah,
curve.
He's not a medical
Where
doctor.
you-
Like a red blood cell is totally round, and then if you have sickle cell, it's not completely round like that.
It's like crescent shaped, kind of.
Yeah.
That's why it's
Like a
sickle
sickle,
cell.
Oh, okay.
So it makes it more difficult for the bacteria to actually attack your blood and transfer through your body that way because your blood's all screwed up.
Okay.
I really don't. Yeah. That sounds as good as any explanation I've heard. All right. So Europeans do quinine. That's why it became like for European colonials. Excuse me. Having a gin and tonic was part of the lifestyle. You put your gin and your tonic water together and have a little drink, every day at 4 o'clock, so that you would, defend yourself against mosquitoes. And that's how we get the drink, gin and tonic. But anyway, it's the drink of all colonialists everywhere. Have a gin and tonic, and let's oppress the masses. All right. Now, so you had this real race for empire going on, and eventually, this race for empire would actually. Did you know that France and Great Britain almost came close to war in 1898? Just a couple of years before they actually signed an alliance with one another over competition for Africa. But we've gone for quite a while here. Why don't we take a little break, and then we'll finish this up. Plus, I'm coughing, so I gotta stop.
Sit there all day.
All right, let's get going here now. Now, I mentioned that the race for Africa. In the case of in France and Great Britain, there really was a race. In 1898, there was the British were fighting. The British had occupied Egypt, And what they found that in the Sudan, they faced, south of Egypt, they faced a problem in the sense that in the Sudan, the people who live in the Sudan were convinced that the Mahdi, the great one sent by God to bring about the end of the world, had arrived among their ranks. They thought that in the Sudan. They were Muslims. And so they rallied around this Mahdi who was going to lead them to victory against the evil infidels. And so the British government decided to operate, to take action into the Sudan. Well, this brought them into the Nile Valley. They went deep into the Nile. And nobody knew where the Nile began at this point. And when Lord Kitchener, Mr. Gordon, commanded the British troops in the Sudan and started marching up the Nile River, marching south up the Nile River into the Sudan, there was a lot of talk about how he wasn't going to stop until the British were able to link up with their territories that they already controlled in South and Central Africa. And so many people thought that if Lord Kitchener was successful and was able to continue his annexation of all the Sudan and control the entire Nile Valley, then potentially the British would control a swath of Africa from Egypt in the north all the way to South Africa in the south, and would become the dominant power in Africa. So when news of Lord Kitchener's march south reached France, the commander of French West Africa, his name was Jean-Baptiste Marchand, he was told, you need to stop this because we can't allow the British to dominate Africa. So he was told to march. He was over, the French had dominated West Africa, what is today places like Chad and Mali and Central African Republic. All these areas in West and North and Central Africa have been kind of swallowed up by the French. And now Marchand was given orders that he was to go and intercept Kitchener. And he did. It was one of the great stories in history. You got Marchand marching as fast as he could across deserts, across jungles, doing everything he can to get and intercept Lord Kitchener's forces coming down or up the Nile Valley. And at Fashoda, in what is today in the southern part of Sudan, at Fashoda in 1898, the two armies came together. And they thought about firing on each other. They really didn't know what to do, because Marchand knew that if he fired, that might lead to war between Great Britain and France. And at this particular point, you had a stalemate with these two armies facing each other. And Lord Kitchener was a little more brazen. He said, "I demand that your troops leave now." And Marchand, in the game of chicken, he blinked. So Marchand said, "Okay, whatever," and he moved his troops out of it. Well, Marchand went home, and the French were furious. They're thinking, "This is a national disgrace." And some French were saying, "Marchand is in league with the Jews and the Protestants to destroy France. He must be destroyed." The French were just going nuts. And they were demanding that something be done. And the two countries almost went to war. Now, 6 years from now, in 1904, they become allies. But this kind of shows you how the British, when they made an alliance with the French, they didn't do it because they liked the French. They did it because they saw that even though they disliked the French, the Germans were even a greater threat. All right. Now, just want to mention. I mentioned some exceptions. Most of the area of Europe was taken over by the great powers like France and Great Britain and Germany, but there were some exceptions. Like what is today the Congo in the central part of Africa was taken over by Belgium. Now, how this took place is one of the great crimes in the history of humanity. It's up there, maybe not as in terms of numbers like the Holocaust, but pretty awful numbers. Leopold II was the king, the constitutional king of Belgium. And what happened is he hired a world-renowned explorer by the name of Henry Morton Stanley. Here's Stanley, right here. Here's Stanley, and here's old Leopold here. And Morton Stanley, interesting guy. He was born in Great Britain, came to America as a young kid. He actually, as a young man, fought in the Union Army and deserted. And then started a world tour, and he established a name for himself as an African explorer. And he was world renowned. And what happened is Leopold II hired Stanley to go to sail up the Congo River in Central Africa and to create and to make contact with the tribes and the peoples who lived in those areas. Now, Stanley was able to make treaties, quote unquote, with all these people where they recognized Leopold as their king. He offered them incentives and all that. And Leopold II, he announced to the world that this whole project was an effort by him to bring civilization to Africa. That he was going to, in Central Africa, he was going to take all these peoples and create a United States of Africa and bring civilization and European law and railroads and progress deep into the heart of Africa. So that was what he was telling the world. But what was Leopold II doing when the world wasn't looking? What he did in Congo was that he found certain tribes that he would pay to be mercenaries. And their job was to terrorize the rest of the population. For example, they would go into villages and say, we want all your people to be enslaved. And if we don't, we're going to kill you. And what Leopold's government, in order to ensure that they were killing as many people they were supposed to kill, they would say, okay, you have to cut off the people's hands you kill, and we'll count them to make sure you're doing your job. So they would actually go into villages. If let's say a village said, hey, we're not going to be your slaves, they would say, okay, you're all dead. And then after they killed them, they would cut off their hands, and then you'd have Belgian officials counting the hands to make sure that they did their job. And they would receive bounties based on how many people they killed. Now, why would he do that? Why would he create a system where thousands of people were being enslaved and using force, using terror, using mass killing to enslave all these people? Well, Congo was rich in diamonds and also in rubber. And so basically, basically Leopold II became one of the richest men in the world because he literally found a diamond mine, lots of diamond mines.
Is that where the term blood diamonds?
Well, it's still going on today,
Yeah.
this whole thing,
Tommy,
yeah.
like,
So he was making a fortune selling diamonds and just basically ransacking this country, using the people there as slave laborers, and enforcing his rule by acts of terror, mass killings on a large scale. Many people think that a lot of the bloodshed that goes on in Congo to this day, I mean, there was a war that was fought there just about 15 years ago where 2 million people died. And a lot of the violence is the fact that you still have this kind of mentality of one tribe or one ethnic group hating the other ethnic groups. Because Leopold's Congo was built on fomenting hatred. He used the hatred, he would foment hatreds between one tribe and another so he could get one tribe to be his executioners to impose his will on the others. Now, this situation, Leopold II, he was being hailed as this humanitarian, as this great man. Everybody was praising him. Meanwhile, he was killing thousands and thousands of people in the Congo. And in fact, he built libraries and museums in Brussels. And everybody, based on the gold, not the gold, but the diamonds that he was stealing from Congo. Now, eventually, though, the world got word of what was going on. It was actually an American. It was an American Methodist minister by the name of William Shepherd. There's his picture there. He was in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he had gone to Africa for missionary purposes. And he wasn't the only one, but he was one of the first to let the world know, hey, it's not what it seems in the Congo. And there are other journalists who started to spread the word. But by the time the world became aware of what had fully happened in the Congo, Leopold was dead. Just to give you an idea of how sick Leopold was, when he was 70 years old, his mistress was 13. So he was kind of a creepy, weird, gross guy. It's actually the in-law of Queen Victoria. His brother was married to Queen Victoria, or no, his uncle was married to Queen Victoria. But anyway, real nice guy. But eventually the Belgian government had to go in there, step in, and take over directly control of. As long as Leopold was alive, he had complete control of the territory, and his officials were the only ones who had control. But after 1908, the Belgian government took over control of the Congo, and there weren't quite and the excesses stopped at that point, but not after there had been this international outcry. So Congo is kind of an interesting kind of side story, but it's a terrible side story. I mean, thousands of people killed and thousands, maybe millions killed. We don't really know the numbers. It was a terrible event in history. Another interesting story is what happened in Ethiopia. The Italians decided that they had to be a world power too. And the Italians were the ones who occupied Somalia. Well, the Italians decided that in 1886 that they were going to occupy Ethiopia as well. So they sent their forces into Ethiopia. And the thing about the Ethiopians is that Ethiopia, the Ethiopian emperor at the time, their empire was up in the mountains. There's mountains in Ethiopia, in parts of Ethiopia, and the empire of the Ethiopian king was in these mountain passes, in these mountain valleys. So basically, when the Italians invaded Ethiopia, what happens is they found themselves in a situation where they were marching through very narrow valleys, and so that put them in a situation where they could be ambushed by smaller, less well-armed forces. So these Ethiopians, armed only with like bows and arrows and flintlock guns, they were able to trap the Italian army at Adwa and completely demolish it. This was one of the only times in the 19th century where an African army just beat the crap out of a European army. And the Italians never forgot it. It was like a big chip on their shoulder. They'd say, oh, those Italians can't even conquer the Ethiopians. Losers. Hey, look at it. You Italians suck. I mean, they hated it. That's why in 1935, one of the first things Mussolini did was to conquer Ethiopia, man. He was going to send a message. We're back, man. We're bad. We're Italians. Yeah, right.
After moving?
But anyway, did somebody say something? Oh, well, anyway. So that's I wanted to mention that story. So that's why Ethiopia was the only African country that maintained its native government in this period. All right. Now, like I mentioned, that the British didn't like the Germans, and see, the Germans kind of got into it as well. Now, when Bismarck was calling the shots in Germany, he did not give a flick about imperialism. But he knew that there were a lot of middle-class Germans, the middle-class German nationalists who believed that acquiring an overseas empire was essential for Germany's greatness. So, in fact, there was a lobbyist group called the German Colonial League, organized in 1882, that wanted to lobby the government to expand its empire, to conquer lands in Asia and Africa. And in fact, in 1884, German troops they got involved in the race. They occupied Tanzania in East Africa, Togo in West Africa, and Cameroon. These territories, just like the French were gobbling up territories in the British, so too the Germans. Now, when Bismarck got replaced, when he was let go in 1890, though, William II was a big believer in naval power. He had bought into this whole idea that a great nation had to have a great navy, and he decided that the first goal of the German government was to really expand its navy. So in 1897, for example, he pushed through the legislature a bill that basically just vastly expanded the German Navy, ordered the construction of all these new battleships. Now, Germany was an industrial power, right? And so when the British saw the Germans beginning to build this massive fleet, they knew that the Germans had the facilities and the resources to build a fleet that would be bigger than theirs. We had fleet envy going on here. So the British were like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? These Germans, we're supposed to have the most powerful navy in the world. And the Germans, they have the potential to create a navy that's bigger than ours. So German naval expansion really freaked out the British. Now, another thing that really freaked out the British and made them hate and have contempt for the Germans was the whole affair surrounding the Boer War. big major event in world history. So let's talk about the Boer War. Now, to understand the Boer War, you have to understand who the Boers were. Comes from Trek Boers. Boer is simply comes from the German word for farmer. And what had happened is that back in the 17th century, in the heyday of the Dutch period, the Dutch colonists had settled in South Africa. They you know, when the Dutch had a big colonial empire in Dutch East India, in what is today Indonesia, and they established a colony at Cape Town in South Africa because Dutch ships would stop in Africa on the way to the Indian Ocean. So they brought in a bunch of Dutch and German colonists to settle in Cape Town. Now these German and Dutch settlers, they live in a very isolated area away from the rest of the world, so they soon developed their own language. It's called the Afrikaner. It's kind of a mishmash of German and Dutch. So you have these white Afrikaners descended from German and Dutch settlers living in Cape Town, and they built an economy that was based on slave labor, using native Africans as slaves, and raising crops and the livestock on a large scale. Now, during the Napoleonic Wars, when the French had occupied the Netherlands, the British decided to occupy Cape Town. So in 1806, the British took over Cape Town, became part of the British Empire. The British took control of the area for the same reason that the Dutch had. They saw it as a good stopping off point for ships heading to India. So now, remember in 1832, as part of the Reform Parliament, Parliament did something. Anybody remember what they did as part of the Reform of 1832? They passed a law. Anybody want to know what that was? Remember they abolished slavery? Right? Now they abolished slavery everywhere in the British Empire. Now there weren't any slaves in England at the time, but there were a whole lot of slaves in South Africa. There are other slaves in Bahamas and in Jamaica, and there was part of the system was that slave owners would be compensated over time for freeing their slaves. But you see, for a lot of the Trek Boers, the Afrikaners who lived in Cape Town, they didn't want to give up their slaves. That was part of their culture. They didn't want to give up their slaves. They didn't like being told what to do by British. I mean, they had their own language, their own culture. They didn't like English. So what happens is, beginning in the 1830s, 1840s, thousands upon thousands of Trek Boers or Boers left their homes in the south of Africa, and they moved north into the interior of Africa. They established independent republics. Like one republic was called the Orange Free State. Another republic was called the Transvaal. When they moved north, they crossed the Vaal River, and that's why they were called the Republic Beyond the Vaal River. Now, when they expanded into this area, though, they found themselves at loggerheads with the natives. Now, the natives were Zulus. Now, the Zulu Confederation was a pretty powerful organization, and they raised cattle too. And so the people raising cattle, the Boers, who were kind of like cowboys, they're like the cowboys of South Africa. You know, they found themselves fighting range wars with the Zulus because both of the Zulus and the Boers were competing for pasture, for control. So as soon as these people were in place, they were fighting wars against the Zulus. Now, the British government, though, the British government didn't do anything about these republics, but in 1872 they were trying to. This was a part of a general policy where they were trying to give more autonomy and self-government to the parts of their empire. So remember, in 1867 they created the Dominion of Canada, and the idea was that they wanted to get the Canadians on board and give them more autonomy and self-government. Well, the same thing happened in South Africa. In 1872, the British government created the independent, well, it wasn't independent, but the self-government of the Federation of South Africa. And they hoped that these free republics, Boer republics, would join the Federation. But what happened is that they had no interest in joining the Federation. So this effort to try to include them within the British Empire fell on deaf ears. This didn't happen. Well, by the time you get to the 1890s, though, all of a sudden, during the race for empire, all of a sudden the Brits were even more adamant that they needed to acquire the control of these territories. And so, for example, there was a man by the name of Cecil Rhodes. He was one of the great stories in history. He was came to South Africa from England, poor as poor, and built a diamond empire. He became one of the wealthiest men in the world, owning diamond mines. You've heard of De Beers Diamonds, haven't you? He started that company. He became one of the wealthiest men in the world, but he was a big English nationalist, and he had a vision of British domination of Africa. In fact, he personally built a company to further northern expansion of the British Empire. He colonized what is today Zimbabwe and Zambia, which was then, in honor of himself, he wasn't a man who was humble. It was called Rhodesia. So he financed the company that colonized an area which was named after himself, Rhodesia. And so he was a big believer in expansion. And so the people like Cecil Rhodes had lots of followers, lots of people who agreed with him that the British needed to expand. But as the British looked around Africa, they saw these Orange Free Republic and this Transvaal as still being staunchly independent, refusing to join the British Empire. Well, about 1895, 1894, they discovered gold in the Transvaal. And there was a gold rush. Just like gold rushes in America. There was a gold rush in the Transvaal. All of a sudden, all these thousands of gold miners were in the Transvaal. Well, the government of the Transvaal, they didn't want all these foreigners in their country. So the government of Transvaal said, all foreigners, get out. We don't want you in our country. We don't want these illegal gold mining. We control this country. Get out. So what happened is that the British government decided, in the name of protecting these gold miners, protecting their ethnic, protecting English citizens in the Transvaal, the British government sent forces to occupy the Transvaal in 1896. And Transvaal forces under the President Paul Kruger, who was the president of the Transvaal Republic, they defeated the British. I mean, nobody saw that coming. An outnumbered force of Boers defeated the mighty British Empire. And this is where Germany gets involved. William II sends a note of congratulation to Paul Kruger. He says, yes, German peoples defeated the English. Germans are superior. We're number one. British suck. You know, it's interesting that he thought that because his mother was English. I think he was a homosexual, so maybe there was some hostility with his mother or something. I don't know. I don't know what was going on. Because his mother was English, you know, but he was, yes, those English suck. Oh, yes, this is great, you know. So that's what started. The British were just humiliated that they lost to the Transvaal. They're humiliated that the German emperor was praising Transvaal. It was a big black eye to Great Britain, and that would spark the Boer War. And that would be even more of a black eye in the British Empire. All right. Well, we ran out of time today, so we're gonna finish up talking about imperialism and finish up Africa, talk about Asia, and then talk about the events leading up to World War I. We'll do that next week.